Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a piece of history that honestly sounds like it was ripped straight out of a big-budget fantasy movie, but I promise you it is absolutely real. We're going to unpack the legendary Battle of the Ice. This is basically the ultimate underdog story. It's about how a young Russian prince used the most brutal, unforgiving terrain imaginable, literally a frozen lake, to absolutely crush what were essentially the medieval special forces of the Crusades. It is just a complete masterclass in strategy, geography, and honestly, pure nerve.
So, I want you to picture this. It's April 5th, 1242. Plunge yourself right onto the bone-chilling, frozen surface of Lake Peipus, sitting right on the border of modern-day Estonia and Russia. The wind is just howling around you, and looking ahead, you see a literal wall of iron marching your way. These are the elite, heavily armored cavalry of the Teutonic Knights, and their goal is to wipe out the very last independent Russian stronghold on the map. It's an absolutely terrifying scenario. But to really get how massive this standoff on the ice was, we kind of need to zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture.
Which brings us to Section 1, a battered, fractured Russia, the 13th century geopolitical board.
See, Russia at this time wasn't the unified state we think of today. It had completely shattered into this chaotic patchwork of feuding princedoms, and the land itself had been, well, bled white. Over in the east, the Mongols, led by the ruthless Batu Khan, had just torn through the territory. I mean, they were an absolute force of nature. They were burning entire cities to the ground and slaughtering anybody who even thought about putting up a fight. It was a deeply terrifying context for the people trying to survive there.
But there was one lone exception in all of this chaos, and that was Novgorod. Now, Novgorod managed to survive this eastern onslaught, but they only did it by making a wildly difficult, strictly pragmatic choice. They basically swallowed their pride and chose to submit to the Mongol threat rather than face total annihilation. And because of that really bitter compromise, Novgorod remained the very last independent Russian stronghold. But, survival in the 13th century, yeah, that was pretty fleeting.
Let's move to Section 2. Enter the Teutonic Knights, a new danger from the west. This really perfectly illustrates the impossible squeeze they were in. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Over on the left, you've got this deadly existential threat from the east, the Mongols, under Batu Khan, enforcing the Tatar Yoke. And then on the right, this brand new danger rolls in from the west. The heavily armored Teutonic Knights looked at this bleeding, completely fractured nation and thought, wow, perfect target for a new crusade. It's your classic David versus Goliath setup, with Novgorod literally trapped between the brutal dominion of the east and the unforgiving steel of the west.
Enter this man, Alexander Nevsky. He's a young prince who suddenly wakes up to find the crushing responsibility of saving whatever was left of the Russian spirit resting squarely on his shoulders. Think about that pressure for a second. He is tasked with defending Novgorod against the absolute most feared heavy cavalry in all of Europe, while his own country is virtually topped out of resources. So how in the world do you possibly win a fight like that?
Well, that brings us to Section 3, the frozen kill zone, a gamble on ice.
Okay, the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is the enemy's battle doctrine. The Teutonic Knights used this terrifying heavy cavalry tactic known as the boar. It was this massive, wedge-shaped formation. Think of it like a medieval armor-piercing round. It had exactly one job: punch a violent, unstoppable hole straight through the center of an enemy's line. And that was the specific tactical nightmare Alexander Nevsky had to solve. He knew for a fact that if he met the boar head-on while standing on solid ground, his forces would just be pulverized.
So here is Nevsky's brilliant, totally audacious trap, step by step. Step 1. He picks the ultimate kill zone by intentionally luring the knights out onto the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. Step 2. Because he knows exactly how that boar formation operates, he purposely weakens his own center line. Basically, he's inviting them right in. Come right here, exactly where you want to strike. Step 3. He stacks all of his best, most battle-hardened troops on his flanks. So the knights charge. They drive deep into that weak Russian middle, just like they planned. But then they hit deep snow and super slick ice. Suddenly, those massive war horses are violently bogged down. And that is when Nevsky pulls off Step 4. He reveals his audacity by signaling those packed flanks to close in, completely wrapping around and enveloping the immobilized heavy cavalry.
Now, I want you to really put yourself in that human element for a second. The ice begins to groan. Imagine the sheer, suffocating panic of being one of those elite knights. You're trapped in heavy plate armor. Your warhorse is totally exhausted, stuck deep in the snow. You're completely surrounded by the enemy. And then, out of nowhere, you start hearing these sharp, deafening cracks echoing right beneath your feet. The frozen lake is literally giving way under the immense, concentrated combat weight of your own shattered wedge formation.
What happens next is what military historians call the grim logic of attrition. The Teutonic Knights completely lost their ability to maneuver, which, let's be real, was their single greatest asset. Once that heavy cavalry formation shattered, the Russian militia, and remember, a lot of these guys were just ordinary, lightly armed locals desperately fighting for their homes, were able to swarm in. They were literally pulling these immobilized, ironclad Crusaders right off their horses and onto the ice. It wasn't some glorious, pristine cavalry charge. It was a gritty, desperate, and ultimately victorious brawl for survival.
Moving into Section 4. Nevsky's enduring imperial legacy, securing the frontier. You see, Alexander Nevsky's grand strategy was an incredible, masterclass balancing act. Just look at how he handled these two massive existential threats. On the east, you have the Mongols. His strategy? Pragmatic submission. He accepted the Tatar Yoke because he was smart enough to know that fighting the Mongols meant total erasure. You don't fight a hurricane. But on the west, facing those Teutonic Knights, his strategy was a brilliant tactical victory on the ice. He fought where he knew he could actually win, and he yielded where he had to just to survive. By crushing the Knights at Lake Peipus, he secured that western frontier and saved Novgorod from what would have been a fatal second conquest.
And because he played that impossible hand so perfectly, Alexander Nevsky is still deeply venerated today. This one specific tactical victory on the ice preserved the nation's core during literally its darkest hour. By keeping Novgorod safe, Nevsky essentially ensured that a unified Russian identity survived the 13th century. He preserved the cultural and political foundation that would, centuries later, finally cast off those chains and grow into a massive global empire.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. 800 years later, in an era of incredibly advanced warfare, we're talking drones, satellites, supersonic jets. Is terrain still the ultimate weapon? I mean, Nevsky didn't win because he had better armor or a bigger army. He won because he understood the ice beneath his feet better than his enemy did. It really makes you wonder how the physical geography of tomorrow's battlefields will dictate the fate of modern empires. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you think you know, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.